The bedroom was quiet except for Tom Miller's soft snoring. Susan sat up in bed, watching him sleep. The moonlight through the window showed his face, a face she once loved but now could barely stand to look at. 15 years of marriage had changed everything between them. Susan picked up her phone from the nightstand and checked the time, 3:18 a.m. She couldn't sleep again. Her mind kept going back to the same thoughts. The house was too small. Their bank account was too empty. And Tom was always there, taking up space, spending money, breathing her air. She opened her email and looked at the life insurance policy again. $2 million. The number made her heart beat faster. 2 million reasons to make Tom disappear. Susan got out of bed carefully so she wouldn't wake him. She went to the kitchen and poured a glass of wine. The house was dark and quiet. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her contact list on her phone. She stopped at Beth's name and stared at it for a long time. 3 months ago at lunch, Beth had made a joke. At least, Susan thought it was a joke at the time. "My cousin knows a guy who takes care of problems," Beth had said after Susan complained about Tom forgetting their anniversary then. "Permanent solutions, if you know what I mean." They had laughed about it then. But now, at 3:30 in the morning, it didn't seem like a joke anymore. Susan's finger hovered over Beth's name. Was she really going to do this? She thought about the fight she and Tom had that evening. He had spent money they didn't have on a new fishing rod. When she got angry, he told her to calm down, that it wasn't a big deal. But it was. It was always the same story with him. She pressed the call button before she could change her mind. "Hello." Beth's voice was thick with sleep. "I need that guy's number," Susan said quickly. "The one who takes care of problems." There was a long silence on the other end. "Susan, it's the middle of the night. Are you drunk?" "I'm serious," Susan said. Her hand was shaking. "You said your cousin knows someone." "I need his number." "That was just talk," Beth said, sounding more awake now. "I was just joking around." "Was it a joke? Or do you really know someone?" Susan's voice was hard, determined. Another long pause. "What's going on, Susan? Is everything okay with you and Tom?" Susan laughed, a sharp sound in the quiet kitchen. "Nothing has been okay with me and Tom for years. You know that." Beth sighed. "Look, I don't know what you're thinking, but just give me the number, Beth. Please. I just want to talk to this person. This isn't something to mess around with," Beth warned. "Once you start down this road—" "I know what I'm doing," Susan said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. After another pause, Beth spoke again, her voice low. "I'll text you a number. But Susan, I'm worried about you." "Don't be," Susan said. "For the first time in years I can see a way out." After they hung up, Susan finished her wine and waited. 5 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a text. Just a phone number, nothing else. Susan stared at the number for a long time. In the bedroom, Tom turned over in his sleep, unaware that his wife was planning his death. Susan's finger hovered over the number. $2 million. Freedom. A new life. She saved the number under Jack and went back to bed. Tomorrow, she would make the call. Tomorrow, everything would change. She lay down beside the man she had once promised to love forever and closed her eyes, dreaming of a future where he no longer existed. Susan sat in her car outside the Red Door Bar for 20 minutes before she found the courage to go inside. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. The text from Jack had been clear. 8 p.m. Back booth, come alone. The bar was dark and smelled of beer and old cigarettes. Susan's eyes took a moment to adjust as she walked in. Country music played softly from speakers in the ceiling. A few men sat at the bar watching a baseball game on a small TV. No one looked at her when she entered. She spotted him right away in the back booth. A man with short gray hair wearing a plain black jacket. He didn't look dangerous. He looked ordinary, like someone's uncle or a high school teacher. That made it worse somehow. "You must be Susan," he said as she slid into the booth across from him. His voice was flat, emotionless. "And you're Jack," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded once. "Beth's cousin said you have a problem." Susan took a deep breath. Now that she was here, facing this man, the words were hard to say out loud. "My husband," she finally managed. "Tom." Jack didn't react. He just waited for her to continue. "I want him gone," Susan said. The words came out in a rush. Permanently. Jack took a sip from his beer. Why? The question surprised her. Does it matter? Not to me, Jack said, but it might to you. Most people who sit where you're sitting right now have good reasons, or at least they think they do. Susan felt anger rise in her chest. He's wasting our money. He doesn't care about me anymore. And there's a $2 million life insurance policy. Jack nodded like she had just told him the weather forecast. That'll cost you $10,000, half now, half when it's done. Susan had expected this. She'd been to the bank that morning and taken out $5,000 in cash. She reached into her purse and slid an envelope across the table. Jack took it and put it in his jacket pocket without counting it. I need to know his routine, Jack said, where he goes when he's alone. Susan had prepared for this too. She took out her phone and showed Jack photos of Tom. Then she told him about Tom's job at the hardware store, his morning coffee stop at the same cafe every day, his Thursday night poker games that always ended at 11 p.m. He's predictable, Susan said. That's one of the things I used to like about him. Jack listened carefully, asking a few questions. Then he pulled out a small notebook and wrote something down. 3 days, he said. That soon? Susan felt a sudden panic. Was she really doing this? Is that a problem? Jack asked, watching her face closely. Susan thought about going home to Tom, about pretending everything was normal for 3 more days, about sleeping next to him, knowing he would soon be dead because of her. No, she said. 3 days is fine, but it has to look like an accident or a robbery, nothing that would make the insurance company suspicious. Jack put away his notebook. People get robbed every day. Sometimes they fight back and get hurt. His eyes were cold. Sometimes they die. Susan nodded, feeling sick now. Don't leave town, Jack said, but make sure you have an alibi for Thursday night. I'll be with my sister, Susan said. We're having dinner. Good. Jack stood up. Don't try to contact me again. I'll let you know when it's done. He walked out without looking back. Susan sat alone in the booth for a long time. The music played. The men at the bar cheered at something on the TV. And Susan realized there was no going back now. In 3 days, Tom would be dead, and it would be her fault. He felt nothing but a strange, hollow emptiness inside her chest. 2 days had passed since Susan met with Jack. She moved through the house like a ghost, going through the motions of normal life. She made breakfast for Tom, smiled when he kissed her goodbye each morning, and asked about his day when he came home. But inside she was counting down the hours. Tomorrow was Thursday, poker night, the night Jack would make Tom disappear forever. Susan stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes and looking out the window. Tom was in the backyard mowing the lawn. The afternoon sun made his hair look golden. For a moment, she remembered how they had been when they first met. The way he made her laugh, how safe she felt in his arms. A tiny seed of doubt sprouted in her mind. The phone rang, pulling her from these thoughts. It was her sister Laura. Are we still on for dinner tomorrow night? Laura asked. Yes, Susan said, watching Tom through the window. I need to be out of the house tomorrow night. Everything okay? Laura's voice held concern. You sound strange. I'm fine, Susan lied. Just tired. Tom and I had a fight last night. Another one? What about this time? Susan turned away from the window. The usual. Money, his job, our future. All lies. They hadn't fought in days. Susan had been extra nice to Tom, making sure nothing seemed unusual. No one would suspect she wanted him dead. Maybe you should talk to someone, Laura suggested. A marriage counselor. Susan almost laughed. It was too late for that. Maybe, she said. Anyway, I'll see you tomorrow at 7. After hanging up, Susan went to the bedroom and opened the closet. Hidden in the back, behind her winter clothes, was a small bag packed with essentials. After Tom was gone and the insurance paid out, she planned to move away, start fresh somewhere new where no one knew her. The sound of the back door opening startled her. She quickly pushed the bag deeper into the closet and shut the door. Susan, Tom called from the kitchen. Could you bring me a glass of water? I'm dying of thirst out there. Coming, she called back, trying to keep her voice normal. In the kitchen, she filled a glass with ice water and handed it to Tom. He drank it all in one long gulp. Sweat made his t-shirt stick to his chest. He smiled at her as he put the glass down. Thanks, babe, he said. What would I do without you? The words hit her like a slap. Soon he would find out what it was like without her. Except he wouldn't find out anything because he would be dead. "Are you okay?" Tom asked, looking at her closely. "You look pale." "I'm fine," Susan said quickly, "just thinking about all the laundry I need to do." Tom laughed and kissed her forehead. "Always worrying about something, that's my Susan." He went back outside to finish mowing. Susan leaned against the counter, feeling sick. She took out her phone and stared at Jack's number. She could call it off. Tell him she'd changed her mind. But then what? She'd still be stuck in this life with Tom. The money problems would still be there. The boredom. The resentment. And Jack already had half the money. Would he just walk away if she called it off? She put the phone away. No, it was too late to change course now. The plan was in motion. This time tomorrow, she would be having dinner with Laura while Jack was taking care of Tom. And in a few weeks, after a suitable period of grieving, she would have $2 million and a new life. Susan went to the bedroom and looked at herself in the mirror. "It's almost over," she whispered to her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked back at her with cold, determined eyes. Susan wondered when she had become this person, this woman who could plan her husband's murder without falling apart. But it didn't matter now. There was no going back. Tom Miller wasn't stupid. 15 years of marriage had taught him to notice the small changes in Susan's behavior. The extra coffee she made him in the morning, the way she asked about his schedule more often, the forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Something was wrong. At first he thought she might be having an affair. That would explain her secret phone calls and the way she closed her laptop whenever he walked into the room. But then he noticed other things. She had asked about his life insurance policy last month. She had been extra interested in his poker night schedule. And yesterday he had seen her looking through his wallet while she thought he was asleep. Tom sat at his desk at the hardware store where he worked as a manager. The store was quiet today. He opened his email and stared at the screen, not really seeing it. The doubts about Susan had been growing for weeks, but he hadn't wanted to believe them. They had problems, sure. What couple didn't after 15 years? But he had always thought they would work things out. His phone buzzed with a text. It was from Susan. "Have a good day at work, honey. Love you." Tom frowned. Susan hadn't texted him during work in months, and she hadn't called him honey in even longer. It felt fake, like she was trying too hard. On a hunch, Tom opened his computer's browser history. Susan had used his laptop last week when hers was charging. He scrolled through the pages she had visited. Most were normal. Facebook, news sites, online shopping, but one caught his eye, a search for how to make a murder look like an accident. Tom's blood ran cold. He stared at those words for a long time. Maybe it was for a book she was reading. Maybe it was just curiosity, but deep down he knew better. He picked up the phone and called his old college friend, Bill Anderson. They hadn't talked in months, but Bill had always been someone Tom could trust. And more importantly, Bill was now a detective with the local police. "Tom?" Bill sounded surprised to hear from him. "Everything okay, buddy?" "I'm not sure," Tom said quietly. I think my wife might be trying to kill me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's a serious accusation," Bill finally said. "What makes you think that?" Tom told him everything. The searches, the life insurance questions, the sudden interest in his schedule. "It sounds suspicious," Bill admitted, "but we need more proof before we can do anything." "I found something else," Tom said. A text to someone named Jack. It said, "Thursday night, make it look like a robbery." Bill's voice became serious. "Thursday is tomorrow. Listen to me carefully, Tom. I need you to act normal. Don't let Susan know you suspect anything. Can you do that?" "Yes," Tom said, though his heart was pounding. "Good. I'm going to set up surveillance. If someone is planning to hurt you, we'll catch them in the act." After hanging up, Tom sat at his desk, feeling like the world had shifted under his feet. The woman he had married, the woman he had built a life with, wanted him dead. He drove home after work, his mind racing. Susan was in the kitchen making dinner. She smiled when he walked in. "How was work?" she asked, stirring something on the stove. "Fine," Tom lied, "just a normal day." "I made your favorite, spaghetti and meatballs." Tom nodded, noticing how she avoided his eyes. "Thanks, that's nice of you." And don't forget you have poker tomorrow night, Susan said casually, too casually. I remember, Tom said. Are you still having dinner with Laura? Yes, at 7, Susan said, so we'll both be out. Tom watched her back as she cooked. This woman, who now planned his death, had once been the love of his life. How had they come to this? He felt a deep sadness, but also determination. If Susan wanted to play this dangerous game, she would soon learn that he wasn't the easy target she thought he was. Thursday evening came faster than Tom expected. The police had worked quickly after his call to Bill. 4 officers were now positioned around the neighborhood, waiting and watching. 2 more were inside cars in the parking lot of the bar where Tom's poker game was held every week. Tom kissed Susan goodbye at 6:30. She was dressed nicely in a blue dress and heels for her dinner with Laura. Have fun at poker, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Don't lose too much money. I'll try not to, Tom replied, trying to sound normal despite the knot in his stomach. Enjoy dinner with your sister. He watched from the window as she drove away, then called Bill. She just left, he said. Good, Bill replied. We're in position. Are you ready? Tom took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. Instead of going to his usual poker game, Tom drove to the police station where Bill was waiting. They went to a small room with monitors showing the feeds from cameras that had been set up around Tom's house and the bar. Now we wait, Bill said, placing a hand on Tom's shoulder. If someone shows up to hurt you, we'll catch them in the act. At the same time, Susan sat across from her sister at a fancy restaurant downtown. Laura was talking about her kids, but Susan hardly heard her. She kept checking her phone, waiting for a message from Jack. Are you even listening to me? Laura asked, frowning. Sorry, Susan said, forcing a smile. Just a lot on my mind. Is it Tom? Did you guys have another fight? Susan shook her head. No, everything's fine. Tell me more about Jason's soccer game. As Laura continued talking, Susan's mind was across town, imagining Jack waiting for Tom outside the bar after his poker game. She pictured the robbery that would leave her a widow. Her hands were sweating. She wiped them on her napkin. Back at the police station, the minutes ticked by slowly. Then, just after 9 o'clock, one of the officers watching the monitors pointed at the screen. There, he said. Someone just parked across from the bar. They all leaned forward to look. A man in a black jacket got out of a car and walked toward the bar's entrance. Then he stopped and looked around before moving to stand in the shadows near the door. That's got to be him, Bill said. He grabbed his radio. All units, suspect is at the target location. Hold positions until he makes a move. The man in the black jacket checked his watch, then pulled out his phone and made a call. The police couldn't hear what he was saying, but he seemed agitated, pacing back and forth. He's expecting Tom to be inside, Bill explained to Tom. But you never showed up for poker tonight, so he's confused. After a few minutes, the man put his phone away and walked back to his car. He sat inside for a while, then drove away. He's on the move, Bill said into his radio. Follow him, but keep your distance. Let's see where he goes. They watched as the police followed the man's car across town. To everyone's surprise, he drove directly to the restaurant where Susan was having dinner with Laura. What's he doing? Tom asked, confused. I think he's going to report to your wife that you weren't at the bar, Bill said grimly. The police cameras showed the man parking and entering the restaurant. Inside, Susan's phone buzzed with a text, "Meet me outside now, problem." Susan made an excuse to Laura about needing some fresh air and went outside. As soon as she stepped through the door, Jack approached her. He's not there, Jack said angrily. Your husband never showed up for his poker game. Susan's face went pale. What? But that's impossible. He always goes on Thursdays. Well, he's not there tonight, Jack snapped. You gave me bad information. Before Susan could respond, police cars surrounded them, lights flashing. Officers jumped out with guns drawn. Police, don't move, they shouted. Susan stood frozen in shock as Jack was pushed to the ground and handcuffed. Then an officer approached her. Susan Miller, he said, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. As they put handcuffs on her, Susan saw Tom step out of one of the police cars, watching her with sad eyes. In that moment, she realized her plan for freedom had become her prison sentence. The police station was cold and smelled like old coffee. Susan sat in a small room with gray walls and a metal table. Her blue dress felt wrong here, too fancy, too normal for what was happening. Her makeup was smeared from crying, and her hands shook as she reached for the paper cup of water an officer had given her. Outside the room, Tom watched her through the one-way glass. She looked small and scared, nothing like the woman who had planned his murder. Bill stood next to him, flipping through pages of notes. "Jack is talking," Bill said. "He's told us everything. The meeting at the bar, the $5,000 she paid him, all the details about your schedule she gave him." Tom nodded but said nothing. What was there to say? His wife had tried to have him killed. 15 years of marriage had led to this moment. "She'll go to prison, Tom," Bill said quietly, "for a long time." "I know," Tom finally said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. In the interrogation room, a female detective named Mary sat down across from Susan. She placed a recorder on the table and turned it on. "For the record, state your name," Mary said. "Susan Miller," Susan whispered. "Mrs. Miller, do you understand why you've been arrested?" Susan nodded, then remembered the recorder. "Yes," she said. "Can you tell me in your own words?" Susan stared at the table. "I hired someone to kill my husband." The words hung in the air. Susan couldn't believe she had said them out loud. It had all seemed like a dream, something happening to someone else. But now, in this cold room, it was real. "Why?" Mary asked. Susan looked up, her eyes red from crying. "I don't know anymore. The money, I guess. The insurance. And I was unhappy. So unhappy." Her voice broke. "I've been unhappy for years." Outside, Tom closed his eyes. Had she really been that miserable? Had he been so blind to her unhappiness? "Mr. Miller," an officer said, coming up to Tom and Bill. "Your sister-in-law is here. She's pretty upset. Says she didn't know anything about this." Tom nodded. "I believe her." Laura wouldn't have kept quiet if she knew what Susan was planning. In the waiting area, Laura sat with her face in her hands. When she saw Tom, she stood up, her eyes wide with shock. "Tom, I swear I didn't know," she said. "She told me you two were having problems, but I never imagined she would do something like this." "I know," Tom said. "It's not your fault." Laura hugged him, crying on his shoulder. "What happens now?" Tom didn't know how to answer. His life had fallen apart in a single evening. The future he had planned was gone. Back in the interrogation room, Mary was showing Susan the evidence they had collected. The text messages, the money transfer, Jack's statement. "Your husband knew," Mary said. "He found out what you were planning and came to us. That's why he wasn't at poker tonight." Susan closed her eyes, remembering all the small moments over the past few days. Tom's careful looks, the way he had hugged her longer than usual this morning. Had he known even then that he was hugging a woman who wanted him dead? "Can I see him?" Susan asked suddenly. "Can I talk to Tom?" Mary looked surprised. "That's up to him. I'll ask." When Mary stepped out of the room, Susan put her head down on the cold metal table. Everything was over. Her marriage, her freedom, her life as she knew it. The $2 million that had seemed worth killing for now seemed like nothing compared to what she had lost. Outside, Mary approached Tom. "She wants to see you," she said. Tom looked through the glass at his wife, the woman he had once promised to love forever. The woman who had hired someone to kill him. Did he have anything left to say to her? Did she have anything to say that he wanted to hear? "Okay," he said after a long moment. "I'll talk to her." 3 months later, Susan stood in the courtroom wearing a plain gray dress provided by her lawyer. The room was crowded, but she felt completely alone. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup. She looked older now, the stress of jail and the upcoming trial having taken its toll. Tom sat in the front row behind the prosecutor. He looked different too. He had lost weight, and there were new lines around his eyes. Their eyes met briefly before Susan looked away, unable to face the pain she saw there. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Susan's legs felt weak. This was the day she would learn her fate. The trial had been short. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Jack had made a deal with the prosecutors to testify against her in exchange for a lighter sentence. Her lawyer had told her to plead guilty to reduce her sentence, and she had agreed. What was the point in fighting when she knew what she had done? "All rise." The Honorable Judge Wilson presiding. the bailiff announced. The judge, an older man with gray hair and serious eyes, looked at Susan for a long moment before speaking. Susan Miller, you have pled guilty to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Before I pass sentence, do you wish to make a statement to the court? Susan nodded and stepped forward. Her mouth was dry, and her voice shook as she began to speak. I don't have excuses for what I did, she said. I was unhappy and greedy, and I made a terrible choice. She paused, taking a deep breath. I'm sorry, Tom. I'm so sorry for betraying you and our marriage. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I regret what I did every minute of every day. She turned back to the judge. I accept whatever punishment the court decides is fair. The judge nodded, his expression unchanged. Mr. Miller, would you like to make a victim impact statement? Tom stood slowly. The room was completely silent as he walked to the front. He didn't look at Susan as he faced the judge. Your Honor, 15 years ago I married Susan because I loved her. I thought we would grow old together. His voice was steady but quiet. I don't know when things changed or where we went wrong, but nothing justifies what she planned to do. He paused, and Susan saw his hands trembling slightly. I don't wish her harm. I just want to move on with my life and try to forget the night I learned my wife wanted me dead. The judge thanked Tom, who returned to his seat without looking at Susan. She felt tears running down her face but didn't wipe them away. Susan Miller, the judge said, his voice stern, the crime you have admitted to is among the most serious our society faces. You planned the death of your husband of 15 years for financial gain. The fact that the crime was not completed does not lessen your guilt. The judge paused, looking down at his notes. Taking into account your guilty plea and lack of prior criminal record, I sentence you to 20 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo in Susan's head. 20 years. She would be over 60 when she got out. Her life as she knew it was over. As the bailiff led her away, Susan looked back one last time. Tom was being hugged by Laura, his shoulders shaking slightly. He didn't look up as Susan was taken through the door that led back to the holding cells. In her cell that night, Susan sat on the edge of her bed and thought about karma. She had wanted Tom gone so she could be free and rich. Now Tom was free of her, and she was locked in a cell with nothing. The universe had a strange way of giving people exactly what they deserved. Outside the prison walls, Tom drove home alone to the house they had once shared. He had removed all pictures of Susan and packed away her belongings. Tomorrow, he would put the house up for sale. There were too many memories there now. As he pulled into the driveway, he realized something surprising. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. The anger and betrayal were still there, but they no longer consumed him. He would build a new life without Susan, and maybe someday he would even be able to trust someone again.